Welcome to the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm your hostess, Melanie Joy Pensack, here to share heartfelt conversations with folks recovering from CIRS and with those special people serving the CIRS community. The podcast was created to help bring awareness to the physical, emotional, and mental experiences of folks navigating CIRS day to day. The world needs to know what CIRS folks go through for deeper empathy and understanding. Through stories and vulnerability, we can help the world understand the winding journey of CIRS recovery. Thank you for being here to open your mind and to open your heart. Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to have Nick Sisti here on the podcast today, who is a CIRS overcomer and a really nice guy that I've met online who had great success with the Shoemaker protocol in his Lyme journey and is collecting a lot of great info on CIRS, hoping to bring that out on a website he just shared with me someday.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for listening. I'm super incredibly excited to be featured on here. I spent the last couple of weeks listening to all the episodes on this podcast, and I just have to say it's such a great resource that I wish I had when I was first becoming involved in this diagnosis and overall pathology. I'm super excited to share my experience pretty much from day one. My experience really starts, as I'm told, probably about a year after I was born. There's a little bit I remember from then, but not too much. And it started with an insatiable appetite. I think that would be the first symptom. And I was around 1 year old. And my parents would mention this to the pediatrician, and there was really no actionable advice given. And it started to spiral into some other alarming things, most notably respiratory issues, starting when I was around 2, that were so bad that caused my parents to take me in to get screened for cystic fibrosis, among other things, which I was negative for. As the respiratory issues worsened over the years, this started to progress to some bizarre, unexplainable eczematic skin issues. I'm told there was a scene when I was maybe around 3 or 4 years old where I'm sitting in the hospital and doctors are literally calling in other doctors to try to explain this bizarre rash on my skin.
Wow.
I just want to note that these problems were incredibly severe. They're so severe that, being completely on the other side of it now, I honestly struggle to remember or perceive how severe they truly were because I'm just so out of it now. And I think that my brain thankfully scrubbed out some of the worst parts. But I'm reminded of it whenever I get organically sick. So I actually had the flu a few weeks ago, or something masquerading as the flu. And I hadn't had anything like that for maybe about 3 or 4 years. I think I got COVID like 3 years ago. I very rarely get sick like that. But this knocked me out. And every time I get that traditional like nasty cold for a week, I remember that there was about a decade plus of my life where I felt like this basically every day. And then I had become habituated to it. Scrolling back, we're around like ages 4 or 5 now. And this has continued to get worse and worse. I remember going to respiratory pathologists and breathing into the breath analyzer and indicating some severe disruption. I had chronic sinusitis, so my nose was basically running perpetually every single day, all the time. And at around age 7, my parents took me in to see some sort of naturopath or integrative physician, whatever was available in the late 90s, which was not as comprehensive of a workup as you can get today. We did the allergy tests, I think the IgG and the IgA tests. It indicated a casein allergy and a gluten allergy, so we removed both of those foods. And this was on the cusp of the gluten-free movement, so I was on the cutting edge back then. I was one of the first. We had some of the first gluten-free birthday parties. So I went through that, and over the course of, I think, maybe like a few months, most of the symptoms seemed to dissipate, at least the most intense manifestations of it. And again, this is a while ago, but when my parents tell me I lost a lot of weight, not in a necessarily bad way, but became very thin on this gluten-free diet. And at the time, we're still coming off of the 1970s, grains, movement, etc., low fat, whatever. And there was this pervasive thought that removing these foods would possibly cause some nutritional deficiencies and they're just thinking about the overall psychological food health of the child, which I guess I can understand to a certain degree. And we were influenced to start weaning me back on to these foods. And over time, as we weaned back onto the grains, to the wheat and the dairy, and just a more general kind of all foods diet, I started to get sick again with the same symptoms, manifestation. It took about 3 or 4 years, but I ended up back in the same exact place that I started. And that continued till I was around 17 or 18, when I decided to take matters into my own hands and really start researching on the internet, just trying to get a hold on this, because it was getting to a quite unmanageable point and new things were popping up. I realized that it very much resembled what you see. I call it the end of life spiral in people who are elderly. One thing happens, and then another thing happens, and then this leads to another. And I think it's very similar to the spiral that people end up with. As I like Dr. Richard Horowitz's terminology of this, I think MSIDS, or multi-system infectious disease syndrome. At the time, the chronic Lyme thing was starting to boom a little bit, and I assumed that might be the issue, given that it was the one thing that came up in all of these kind of otherwise unexplainable disorders. There was also a lot of the cognitive issues I was having as well seemed to relate to that. So I started seeing Lyme practitioners in the area. The first one, we waved them off after maybe like a month because it wasn't really going anywhere, and all they had to offer was antibiotics. And the next one seemed to be more comprehensive. I actually connected with her because she was on the show Mystery Diagnosis, in which one of the patients had Lyme. So seeking the cutting edge, I went to her and was given IV antibiotics. And she was actually, I think at the time, a big name researcher in the world of Bartonella. That was where I was exposed to the idea of co-infections. And I was tested and diagnosed for both Lyme and Bartonella at the time. After working with her for about a year with Lyme and Bartonella treatment, with varying results, I started to look for more answers because I had not fully resolved both the sinus issues and a lot of the chronic fatigue I was experiencing. At the time, I was still having a lot of these asthmatic respiratory issues and sinusitis. And I remember one day I just brought her a list of all sorts of random treatments and extra things I found online. And one of those was the Shoemaker protocol. And I remember when I was receiving IV antibiotics in her office, she had this book, I believe it was called Desperation Medicine by Dr. Shoemaker. I always wondered what that was. I had seen this name and I had heard of this biotoxin pathway that talked about in various forums, but at the time it didn't really mean anything to me. It seemed very abstract. But that was one of the things on my list. And when we got to that, she shook her head and she was like, she indicated that she had tried cholestyramine on a few of her patients after seeing Dr. Shoemaker speak at a conference. And it might have been just the early stages of research before the other elements of the protocol. But she just said, oh, I've given that to a few patients. It didn't really do anything and it was a waste of time. So I think you shouldn't follow that. I was like, okay, that was the end of that. At the time, I still did not understand exactly the idea of this biotoxin. I think this is something that a lot of people, when they're starting out with the Lyme world, fall into. And they're just focused on just, okay, get out the bugs. All right, just get it out. And sometimes there are other elements of this to where the bugs cannot even be killed, or that they keep persisting unless you get these other things back into balance. So fast forward a couple of years, I kept seeing more Lyme practitioners. I saw a Lyme practitioner who was at the time the head of ILADS, but again, all he had to offer me was antibiotics. And when I hit a wall with him, he suggested another ILADS practitioner who was an integrative practitioner. This is about 2015. I went to that practitioner, and first appointment, he did a pretty fantastic job of, I think, looking back at it now, laying out the framework for pretty much everything that was overlooked, or everything that needed to be fixed. It's something now that if you go to, for example, there's a great CIRS practitioner, Bruce Hoffman. You go to like all of the possible things that basically can go wrong in CIRS. He has a great presentation on this. I'm reading it, and it's pretty much every single thing that this doctor that I went to had described in our first appointment. about 9 years ago. The research really has become streamlined, and it's great to see that. For that first appointment, he gave me a test prescription for the VIP, the MSH, the MMP9, C4A, all of the labs, among other things. And I had it tested. The two smoking guns were that my MSH was unreadable. So my MSH was that less than 8 on the LabCorp. And the MMP9 was elevated. And I actually did not have really any of the other markers. My C4A was normal. TGF beta 1 was normal. My VIP was normal. But my doctor thought that kind of decimated MSH, along with a lot of the adrenal symptoms I was describing, he thought that was enough to start treatment with the cholestyramine. I'm going to pass the baton back to you. I know that was a lot, but I had to get that origin story out there.
Thank you for all of that. I have some questions from that wonderful account. I'm sorry that you had to go through all of that as a kiddo, as a teenager, and I can't really imagine what it was like at that time, trying to sort through and find information. One question that comes up for me is, as you reflect back on that time, knowing what you know about CIRS and Lyme now, do you think you were in mold as a kid in the house that you were growing up in? Or do you think that you had a Lyme exposure through your mother or as a child in some way?
That question has kept me up many nights. And the thing is, I'll be completely honest about this. As I continued to get better, and as I continued to, over a very long period of time, uncover a lot of these layers, my knowledge of these layers has allowed me to become a person that maybe I would not have been capable of being had I not gone through this experience. As I continued to uncover more and more layers and learn more about things like methylation and control of inflammation, all of the amazing dietary things that I've stumbled upon and learned about over these past few years, I started to become thankful of the situation in a way. And that's when that question stopped keeping me up at night. But quite frankly, it could have been, I know that at the time, my childhood bedroom was right next to a very old kind of dusty attic, which was actually later demolished because we had the whole top half of the house renovated. So now that's no longer there. I know that we had an ERMI done on the house a few years ago, and it was not that substantive. I don't have it on me, but I know that the score was low. There wasn't anything glaring on it. I had my doctor look at it, and he's all around integrative physician. Maybe if I took it to a shoemaker specialist or someone dedicated in that field, they might have some more intel on that, but it was certainly not that glaring. However, I did have probably hundreds of tick bites. We live in North Jersey, right next to the woods, basically outside all the time. At least before there was a spate of chronic fatigue after maybe 10 years of life, when this started to really rear its ugly head. I was a very active child, outside all the time, pulling ticks off of me all day. So I have no doubt that the Lyme/Bartonella/ possibly Babesia, never tested positive for it, but I know that there's false negatives, and I know that all these ticks carry all these things. I have no doubt that's the main thing. I will say though, I do think if one is susceptible, just going into somebody else's house or going into any moldy building, I remember certain things like our clubhouse at the lake that we were members of, right? Hadn't been renovated in 100 years, probably since they built it like 100 years ago, right? There's probably mold in there. I've been into gymnasiums. We walk in like school gymnasiums, you can instantly smell the must. I think if there is a mold aspect of it, it could have been from that attic in the house, but then we tested it years after it was demolished. So maybe that was why nothing really showed up. I've also learned though from listening to your podcast, a few of the episodes, that there's endless ways to detect mold. And I obviously did not exhaust all of the methods for mold detection, but it's certainly possible there could have been something in the house.
It's such a good point. As kids, you're outside playing all the time. You were in Jersey. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I had woods in the backyard, always out there playing. I actually don't remember any tick bites, but that's not to say that there weren't things crawling on me. I was out in the grass in the woods all the time. I remember Girl Scouts in the basement of churches and really rusty campsites. We didn't know any different then. It was so common where I grew up for a place to maybe have a musty smell, go over to so-and-so's cellar and you're playing or having a sleepover there. And it's
Yep.
just common life. We know so much more now. So it's just interesting as the research develops and time goes on to think back. I wonder if this was a part of it. But I also appreciate what you said about at some point you have to let that go and just be grateful for where you are now with it, because we think we know so much, but there's still so much we don't know. Letting that go, I'm sure, is also helpful in the recovery process too.
It's very liberating. It's very liberating. I think it's beautiful that that liberation occurred when I felt I had fortified my system enough to, for example, if I walk into a musty building now, again, I don't want to diminish anyone's situation because, quite frankly, this for me, I've described all of the symptoms and they were severe. If I do believe that it was, if you laid out exactly what happened on paper, it might be one of the, because I've read case studies. I've read tons of case studies on pediatric Lyme disease, pediatric manifestations of severe oxidative stress, methylation issues, childhood asthma. And I do believe that my case, coupled against those case studies in the literature, is probably right up there with one of the worst because of its severe chronic nature. But that being said, I have never been really physically or mobily disabled. And I have had no joint issues, no inability of movement whatsoever. And that's been a paradox in this. And I know that's an issue for a lot of people. So what I'm getting at here is staying localized to those symptoms. Everything that I do in my somewhat prophylactic maintenance of this, like I still take a couple cholestyramines here and there, like a couple servings, like maybe once or twice a day. Maybe I'll go a couple days without it. And then if I walk into a weird smelling building, when I get home, I'll just take a serving of cholestyramine. And I literally envisioned, okay, I walked in this weird building. Now the toxin's being flushed out. We're good. Or if I pull a tick off of me in the woods, and I don't know if that's exactly how things are going on under the hood, but that's happened to me enough without any ramifications that I just have to believe that. And that gives me confidence in that knowledge and that biofeedback of walking away from that building and still being perfectly healthy and not having a years long setback. But that's my personal situation with it. I know it's not the same for everyone. And I also know that the goal, especially with the VIP treatment in this protocol, it is getting people to a point where they can tolerate transient exposures without having it upend their life. It's great to be sitting in that.
That's so inspiring for people to hear, even with the really significant presentation that you had as a kid and a teen, to now be living a life and to be able to go into some buildings and do some prophylactic CSM and not be debilitated from walking into that building really shows the impact that the protocol can have and the resilience of the body to come back once it really gets what it needs. Not saying that people don't need to be careful and everybody has their different level of resilience, as you're pointing to, but to be able to live a full life after that start in life is, I'm sure, very inspiring for people to hear.
This kind of goes back to what I was saying about this over time, as you get better from this and as you realize the gravity of it, the gravity in the sense of you can see how severe and how critical this unfortunately not known about issue can be, so up front in your face and so utterly severe. You realize that more the better that you get from it. At a certain point throughout the years, I stopped thinking of myself when experimenting with different modalities. I'm doing all of this, spending all this money on these things, and I'm trying all these different supplements. I'm really coming upon some quite profound knowledge. The only way that this makes sense, the only way to truly come out on the other side of this is to pay it forward. If there's one person out there, if I do eventually publish a resource, a website, or a book or something, or do any video content on this, if there's just one person out there who benefits and it doesn't take them 3 or 4 years to get to whatever modality I'm discussing, then my work is done. That's just a full circle, I think, brilliant sense of purpose. And so that's what I'm building up to.
I love that. I'm sure people would love to see the resources that you put together or a book or anything that you would share. I think about your parents going through this experience. I know that there are people listening who are parents who have children going through CIRS, and they worry, what's their life going to look like? And how are they going to turn out emotionally, mentally, physically? How is it going to impact them in the future? I think how you're articulating your story can be inspirational for them. How did it impact your parents when they saw you doing your own investigation and starting to recover?
My parents were always very supportive. I started taking the reins in that arena when I was just a teenager, so they were the ones funding this and taking me to doctors. I think that speaks volumes of kind of says it all, their support, that they trusted the process. At a certain point, to them, they just wanted me to get better more than anything else. I think that they trusted that I had the wherewithal, at least with the resources that I had amassed, to move in a direction that would allow me to be as productive. And I say this kind of facetiously, but your children you're looking for the ROI of children. So like the return of investment, literally, of, okay, I've brought this child up into the world, I've funded their future, okay, and now it's okay, they're off out of the nest, and now it's their turn to make money and just go and live their life. And that's what was running in the back of my mind, was like, okay, if I don't get better from this, okay, then what is the point? What is the point to having been raised, for them to have me as a child? Like, if I don't then go and be a productive member of the workforce. I made that very clear as I was going through this. With each development in my healing, I took clear steps to prove that to them. My main career is basically a musician slash writer slash audio engineer. I've been doing that basically my whole life in various degrees. And that was something that I was trying to build up at the time while juggling this CIRS nonsense. One of the major things that I experienced in the progressive healing from this illness, which this portion came relatively quick, I wouldn't say, I was about to say increase in cognitive ability, but it's more so my return to the cognitive ability that I started with as a child, and my wherewithal and sense of creativity. At the time that I started healing from this, I started taking classes at community college, and it went from just taking like one or two classes and still being very ill at the time and very chronically fatigued. And it got to the point where I was in the honors program, completely soaking it up. At the time, I was taking a lot of literature classes, and I was riding on this high of just like feeling all this creative energy, this creative and physical renaissance from not having chronic sinusitis, and my brain feeling opened up. That was just from taking a few cholestyramines a day for a few months at the time. But it really made that significant of an impact, and got to the point where I was getting my recommendations from my professors a couple years into this protocol. That was something that really hit me. And when it also hit my parents, the significance of all of this, and that this protocol had really brought an entire brain back from the depths of sickness. And I would say it's twofold. I'm not sure if I know that there's the associations with Alzheimer's and this illness and the hypometabolism of the brain that I've seen discussed. I think Shoemaker published a paper on that. I've seen referenced in various capacities. So it could have been that was suppressing my full cognitive ability, or it could have just been the fact that the physical aspects and the accompanying fatigue were indirectly clouding or taking up too much brain power to focus on things other than how you feel moment to moment. But that started to progress over the next few years, well surpassing my wildest dreams and what I'm capable of in music and writing and my involvement. I think that speaks volumes for the cognitive aspect of this illness. And
well done. Congratulations on accomplishing all of that. What you're pointing to is such an important piece that sometimes people who are just Lyme practitioners, I think, miss, is that the CIRS piece, the biotoxins, cause the brain issues and the hypometabolism. And so while some people need to be on antibiotics for a period of time, myself included, I'm going through Lyme treatment right now.
Oh, well, okay.
Being on the binder to actually remove the biotoxin is very important. and then going through the rest of the protocol to then repair the brain is really important. And if people are just on antibiotics and they're not repairing the brain at the end, then there can be those lingering post-Lyme symptoms, because we know so many of those symptoms are coming from the brain.
Totally. Yeah, that speaks to my experience because I think I lightly mentioned it, but I want to be clear that before I started with the Shoemaker protocol, I had been taking antibiotics for Lyme and Bartonella for about 2 years. And about 1 year, I was taking ibuprofen for Lyme. And I did experience relief from that, but it did not help as much with the issues with fatigue and some of the other neuropsychiatric issues.
Yep.
That were later attributed to issues with methylation as well, which for me has been another huge component in this. Bruce Hoffman talks about that in his presentations, the connection to methylation. I was taking antibiotics for a number of years, and that's when I hit a wall. And then it's okay. Now we bring in the cholestyramine. That's why just like literally a month of cholestyramine, I felt it. It was significant. I do want to note the methylation aspect of this was so vitally important. I think it might be a chicken or the egg thing. Like, it's yes, if let's say my MSH levels were completely normal, maybe I might not have had the adverse reaction to cholestyramine that I had, which was it was very tough for it to go down. At the time, I was experiencing a lot of decreased gut motility, and I couldn't tolerate the cholestyramine unless I was on some sort of methylation protocol. There's a lot of indicators in the literature that methylation is very important for one's gut motility and peristalsis of the gut. That's also something that is regulated by the hypothalamus to a certain degree. I know the MSH has a relation to that as well. So to me, treating the methylation stuff, just going on the outside of that, I had a number of tests that revealed that I had methylation issues. Once I took that, then the cholestyramine would be flushed out of my system properly. That was an issue early on. The first few doses, it just sat there in like my chest basically. And over time, it was easier to go down. Another thing is that when I do take these prophylactic doses now, I do add, and this is an interesting tip for anyone listening who's having this issue. Again, no medical advice here, disclaimer, but this is what I do. I throw 1/8 of a teaspoon of magnesium citrate. So I get it in a powder, have 1/8 of a teaspoon, nothing more than that. I put it in each serving of cholestyramine, and that seems to mitigate any of the gastrointestinal issues I've experienced with the drug. So
Great tip. You will hear Dr. Shoemaker. He talks about in his teachings that a lot of people with Lyme do have difficulties being able to tolerate CSM. And so that's definitely something for people that are listening and on the CIRS journey. If you're in mold and you think it's mold, but you're also having a hard time with your CSM, it might be curious to investigate if there's Lyme and co-infections that are a part of that too. I had a difficult time with CSM at first. I got past it, and I've been on the Shoemaker protocol for a couple years now, full dose VIP over a year, and in many regards, cognitively, so much has come back, and I'm doing well. But there were more significant neurological symptoms and cyclical presentations and weakness. And it turned out I had multiple co-infections. I think we have 5 infections going on right now, or a mix of active and historical. I myself have started taking antibiotics because I wasn't tolerating the herbs, believe it or not. I wanted to do the herbs, but it was too inflammatory for my system. And doxycycline is a little bit anti-inflammatory. That's actually really helped me with the process. I'm seeing some improvements, but you do need a binder, because when you're killing off bugs, you're making endotoxins in your body, maybe endo and exotoxins. And us folks that are HLA susceptible, you need to bind that up, or it's just recirculating. So it's really important, if you have this genetic predisposition, to have that binder. And like you said, check in on the methylation piece too. It's important.
Totally. And first off, I'm glad to hear you are feeling things clear up with the VIP. My whole story is so sprawling. I would say to the listener, if you do follow my work in the future, you might see a more comprehensive breakdown of this. But I do want to note, I did get to the VIP portion of the protocol after a few years taking cholestyramine intermittently. This was like 2019. I asked my doctor if I could try it because the MSH just was not fully getting over the hump to what he wanted it to be. So the biggest thing that I felt with the VIP was that it felt like, I don't know if I'm like subtly absorbing like what they say here, where they're literally talking about the brain being deprived of oxygen, but before the VIP portion of the treatment. But it literally felt like there was something more flowing to my brain that was not before. The other thing that I noticed with the VIP, later confirmed on subsequent tests where it showed that it was raising my MSH. So I had discussed before my food allergy issues, and I had stayed gluten and dairy free from 2015. Like basically, when I restarted getting into this treatment, I had been completely gluten and dairy free because I know I had that susceptibility. I found the VIP to either reduce or completely eliminate any like food allergic symptoms. So getting itchy or having gastrointestinal distress or having the nasal symptoms I would get eating dairy. And so now I still don't eat gluten. I really don't eat any grains. I do some sort of pseudo carnivore diet, but I do eat some raw dairy sometimes. The issue is that like now if there's any light amount of exposure, like if at a certain point, if there was any, even some barley malt extract on something or something seemingly inconsequential, is that I would severely react to it. And after the VIP, that completely eliminated any food intolerances basically. It's been that way. I haven't taken VIP in a few years.
That is so important. That's really inspiring for people. I want to pop in here through my experience with that. And what I'm seeing working with people is that there's this group of people that's coming and goes through the Shoemaker protocol for mold or actinos or endotoxins, yet they still have like food sensitivities. And that was me. Even when I had been on VIP for a year, I had food sensitivities.
Oh, interesting.
Pretty significantly, but I hadn't yet treated Lyme and co-infection. And so what you're talking about when you did VIP, you had already treated your Lyme and co-infections. And then you were able to maintain having reduced food sensitivities. And I do anticipate that's going to be the case for me, even though I did it opposite of you.
Fascinating.
There's a whole group of people that they are like, why am I not getting past these food sensitivities? I think there's 8 people now that I've sent along that are showing positive co-infections or Lyme.
Really?
Yeah, I feel like this is something that's going to continue to come out into the conversation over the next couple of years, because when I then started taking doxycycline, within 3 weeks, I was able to eat cottage cheese. I was able to eat cream cheese with probiotics. My body was craving dairy and like probiotic, I think, because of what I was, putting into my body with the antibiotics. I hadn't had dairy in 2 years. I was able to eat like some coconut ice cream last week. I've been adding in a few other foods like gelatin and things that are more gut healing. So the big like mast cell reactions I used to have, a big heat flare after eating, definitely has reduced with treatment of the tick-borne co-infections.
It's interesting you describe it as a heat flare. That's exactly how I would think of it. Before I took the VIP back in like 2018, I went through the whole mast cell rabbit hole, tried things like the ketotifen and the cromolyn and everything. And those things did reduce the food reactions. And to be clear, I was already eating a very anti-inflammatory, basically an autoimmune paleo, I guess is what it would be known as, diet here. I was actually reacting to the light amounts of histamine in foods and histamines and meats and things like that. And yeah, the VIP, as well as the mast cell treatments I just identified, like the ketotifen and cromolyn, they both had a significant impact on that. So I'm super glad that's working for you. And also what you're describing, it's so fascinating. The interaction of these different arenas all kind of relating back to CIRS.
Yeah.
I also want to just say on CIRS versus CIRS, I've been saying CIRS for 10 years and I hear everybody saying CIRS, but I heard your episode with I believe her name is Jackie Meinhardt from the Amen Clinic. Actually, funny story about that. My mom was always a huge fan of Dr. Daniel Amen. And at a certain point when I was a kid, my parents were considering taking me to the Amen Clinic. When I was listening to Jackie's episode, I was doing the math and I was like, man, if they had taken me there, was she there at the time they were considering? Like, could this have all been prevented? But no, it was cool to hear her talk about it as CIRS, because that's just what I've been saying for all these years. The interaction of these different fields with CIRS is just incredibly fascinating to me, because it really feels just this coagulation of all of these different people just simultaneously arriving upon the truth by virtue of the internet, basically,
Yeah.
to where in this sort of environment where everybody is so connected, the truth will come out. Yes, some bad ideas will prevail. And with what Judy's doing, for example, with nutrition with Judy Cho, back in like 2017, I started experimenting with carnivore diets to actually reduce the side effects of the cholestyramine. That was actually literally why I started eating a carnivore diet in 2017. I think it's crazy how I'm watching these people from that community. Now they're talking about CIRS and Lyme. It's just bizarre and interesting, and it just relates to just everyone just coming upon the truth.
That's definitely been in the conversation that I've been having with some different people, where everybody's coming back to, oh, this is interrelated to CIRS. This is interrelated to CIRS somehow. And, CIRS looks like, okay, you're going to follow this triangle. It looks very systematic. And in a way it is, right? But we don't live in a bubble. We live in an interconnected world. And all of these people that are researching these different areas, if we all open up our ears and pay attention, I feel everyone could be helped so much faster, like you pointed to earlier.
Totally. I 100% agree. It's interesting because if you think about it, I'm not fully in that world. I do dabble in it because I think a lot of the research is interesting, and I adapt a lot of it to the way I eat. But it's such a conservative idea. I don't want to use the word restrictive because I think it's a very beneficial thing for certain people, but it's such a conservative idea that it kind of is now intersecting with functional and integrative medicine. These ideas in functional and integrative medicine that people in that field have been talking about for 10 to 15 years, but they're getting to it because they're realizing like they just want to get better. I suspect there will be more people from that field talking about things like this in the years to come. There's a problem with flow of information in this world. There does need to be a serious level of legitimate journalism with this, because for better or for worse, that's how things get out. There needs to be some content in this term of the legacy media. There needs to be someone coming out in the Washington Post. I'm saying this begrudgingly, but there's someone needs to come out to the Washington Post or New York Times, whatever, and just talk about CIRS or something. That might just be what's needed in this antiquated system of relevance and legitimacy to seal the deal. That might come before someone like the CDC, if they ever do, starts talking about this. And we all know that's been quite an issue with the Lyme stuff. I'm not even thinking of that as a possibility, but when it becomes unavoidable.
Yeah. All the doctors are, in a way, they're getting information, but they're also in a silo.
Yes.
Too. They're not always seeing some of the details that I think the patients see. Oh, why do all of us have these same food sensitivities? Or why is this group of people all have mast cell? Or why do we all have these methylation issues? We are noticing these patterns and coming back to the doctors about them. I really do hope as well that some good information gets out there that reaches the level of truth that doctors will accept, and also can touch into the general public so they can understand. It's interesting on the back end. I will share some of the surviving mold community when these different articles come out in the New York Times or the Washington Post about Lyme and things. And anybody who's had CIRS reads it and is, oh my gosh, they're talking about CIRS.
Yeah, 100%.
But they're not really saying it. Or they're like, oh, we're getting close to finding out like why chronic Lyme is an issue. Dr. Shoemaker figured this out, 20 years ago. And there are people that do email and follow up and say, hey, you may not have heard about this. I guess there was an article that one girl posted about her experience, and one of the IEPs saw it and was like, wow, look at this. Isn't this CIRS? I'm going to actually reach out to the paper and the person that interviewed this girl, because I want her to know that she might actually have something that could help her. So there are definitely people that do try. There's just a lot of misinformation out there and mindsets that need to be changed. And it's going to take the army, you, me, everybody, to continue to talk about it. And eventually, I do think there will be that overflow, but it takes time.
It's definitely an interesting situation to be in, because I'm viewing this from a very backed out observational perspective. I know full well 40 years from now, I'll be talking about this to someone and I'll be like, oh yeah, I went through CIRS. Yeah, I figured it out about when I was 20. And they'll be like, wait, I'm sorry, you were 20? Wait, that was like 40 years ago. It's only been around for, I think people have been treating it it was discovered in the late 90s. I I think that something will happen where somebody like indirectly discovers this, but somebody who's, I don't know, who has some insane level of influence. What if somebody quote unquote, discovers this? And it would very quickly be realized to the general public that, okay, they did not discover it. Kids will be screened for this in the beginning of their lives. If there's even any question of any chronic issues, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be quite an insane mess when it's fully realized by the public. It's just not being piped through the proper channels. It's not alternative medicine. It's the furthest thing from alternative medicine. Not knocking alternative medicine, but this is clear peer-reviewed research as a protocol. These are, mind you, pharmaceutical drugs that are being used to treat this. So clearly not alternative medicine. But I think that if the level of distrust in these organizations that has accrued over the past couple decades, I think that when this goes big, I think that that'll be the nail in the coffin for that. Like that'll be the highest level of distrust that could possibly exist, because people will be asking how did this fly under the radar for 30 or 40 years to the general public when it was literally discovered, and doctors have been treating this all over the world in isolated situations for decades. How does that even happen? I think it's a testament to this weird shifting of the guard in the flow of information. So
I feel like I'm an old millennial. I'm going to be 42 in August. And I notice in my generation and then those under me, there is a mindset that is much more diffuse in thinking versus singular. There's the ability to pull out and see a bigger picture, to see interconnections, to see these patterns, to see how things flow together. Yep. Versus the isolated way of thinking. I think that in combination with the fact that the research is 2 decades old, Ming Dooley just did a CIRS X talk at the national conference and was talking about how it takes typically 17 years for research to get into medical schools and medical establishments. And we're about the 20-year mark, she said, with Dr. Shoemaker's research. So we're at this critical point, I think, of people thinking very differently and the research starting to get out there and more people, like you said, inadvertently discovering what's already been discovered.
Yes. We think about it. We have this idealized version of scientific discoveries, right? We picture the front headlines of the paper and it's cause of insert illness here discovered. It's very interesting to be on the ground floor of what will be likely a very huge thing. And as I remember from a physician that you had on here, the CIRS lab guy, who I see on Instagram all the time. He's a fantastic resource. I remember his quote of when you're looking at a CIRS patient, you're seeing the future of medicine. And I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah, really profound.
There's so much more to this story. If you guys follow me on Instagram, at a certain point, you'll see me post about this resource. It'll be similar to what Michaela Peterson has, but just another resource to throw in here. My research shifted a lot to methylation imbalances after I had a methylation panel from HDRI. I know that Genova also has one as well that's often recommended. But the difference between a methylation panel and then these MTHFR gene tests, which I had gotten before, is that a methylation panel, it gives you like a full red blood cell count for not just like folate, but also methylfolate, folinic acid, all these other constituents of these very important methylation nutrients. This test can actually tell you if you need to take, for example, methylfolate at all. I think there's an add-on for the test. I didn't get this, but you can also test your methyl B12 levels. This is actually testing the active nutrients in your cells. I got this test done about 3 years ago after I was taking a lot of methylation support based on 23andMe tests showing that I had MTHFR, like I had a light mutation in there. And then I also had a homozygous mutation in MTRR, which indicates that one might need methyl B12 therapy. I was just taking things based on that. And I felt like there was more to the picture. I wasn't experiencing full resolve of the attributed neuropsychiatric issues that were supposedly from that. I was also experiencing some negative side effects from the methylation supplement. I got the methylation panel. It showed more actionable information. It showed that despite years of methylation supplementation, taking multiple grams of methylfolate a day, I was very low in folinic acid. I was also low in NAC. It showed that my reduced glutathione was low, which indicated that my glutathione was not being converted into its active form, which is very common in people with CIRS and oxidative stress. I basically worked off of that very actionable, extremely valuable information for about a year, kind of tweaking around with certain supplements and coming up to my own methylation protocol designed for my own body. One of the biggest revelations, physical revelations that I had through that was that I always had this issue of, I guess, some sort of neuroexcitation. So it could possibly glutamate. I know in some tests I had elevated serotonin, for example. I was at the house and talking to my dad. He would always tell me to lower my voice. He would say it like this. He'd be like, mid-sentence, like I'm in the middle of delivery. He'd be like, "You're talking really loud. You're talking really loud. Could you lower your voice?" There's probably an issue when someone feels the need to cut you off mid-sentence and say, you're talking really loud. I started to have this over the years in multiple arenas, and I could tell that sometimes it was very jarring to people when my voice would come out. To me, it felt completely normal, but the reality was that it was just unregulated through these likely indirect from CIRS and Lyme, but very real neurotransmitter recycling and production issues, which created a very high level of serotonin, possibly glutamate. So once I actually dialed in all the methylation support from this test, ever since then, my dad has not told me to lower my voice once in about 3 years. And I hear it coming out of me, this like much lower, much more reserved. It's a voice that can elevate to those excitatory levels. As an audio engineer, we have something called a limiter in music mixing. Okay. And that's something that you place a limiter on an instrument that is like going way above the line of where you want it to be. And a limiter will keep the dynamics of the instrument, but past a certain point, it won't let it go above that. So I feel like the methylation support based on HDRI's methylation panel has essentially given me a proper limiter. Now, I've not had that outward criticism of my speech since then. I would encourage you to check out the CIRS practitioner, Bruce Hoffman. He seems to be, from what I've seen, like the only one who's put this all into actionable research. He's done a couple talks. If you go to his site, he literally talks about the exact test that I just did and methylation issues.
Thank you for spelling out those insightful observations. When people sort of tune into their own experience, they can relate to it and then take the next step to really check into that and further their healing. We're coming to the end of our time. Just one final question. Would love to know if you could have one magic wish granted, what would you ask to happen within the CIRS community?
CIRS genuinely needs awareness. If you just had a character on a show or a famous person just come out and just say the words or something, or be wearing a shirt, people would look it up. There's so much research on it now. Boom, people would be tuned into the channels. They would just watch one YouTube video and their algorithm will be filled with it. I think literal awareness would be massively helpful.
I love that answer. In the mouth of babes, Elmo can come up, spell CIRS.
Yes. Oh, exactly. 100%.
I'll share this since you're bringing this up. I actually reached out to the group called A Kids Book. Do you know A Kids Book?
No.
They are a company that makes books for children, and they're all about everyday topics. So a kid's book on empathy, a kid's book on racism, a kid's book on cancer. There are all of these topics that help to make complex issues more digestible for kids and help a way for parents to bring them up. I had this idea come in my head the other day where I thought, oh my goodness, what if we had a kid's book about CIRS?
Yeah.
That would probably be completely appropriate for someone with CIRS to read. Children and people would have more awareness next to the book on cancer and racism and all the other things.
Amazing.
Who knows if that'll go anywhere, but yeah, what you're pointing to is really important. Talking about it, getting it out there, and it will be probably magical to see who actually starts talking about it and see this all unfold in the next couple years.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I just want to say, for anyone who's starting to get into the weeds with this, you're coming in at the best possible time so far, because the research is really quite remarkable.
Thank you so much, Nick, for coming on and your time. I think your story is so important. It's inspiring to hear how you've overcome so much and have such a positive attitude on life and on the development of everything that's happening with CIRS and the interrelationship with all these other health concerns. Thanks for your vulnerability, your insights, and all the recommendations. I pointed to in the beginning of the podcast that you're thinking about putting things together for people for more awareness. Please share anything that you want about that and how people can stay in touch with you.
Right now, I mentioned that I'm a audio engineer, a musician, and a writer. I'm also involved tangentially in the film world and the film composing world. And honestly, right now, I'm totally on that track. I'm so enthused that I've been able to get over the hump with this illness to the point where I could exist fully in those worlds very productively. I'm just in this creative renaissance and I love it. I'm fully focused on that right now. And over time, as my time frees up, my second career I'll be building up in the background will be hopefully a influential voice in this space through either a website or maybe a series of video content, using what I know from being in the media space for so long in communications and journalism to leverage my experience to get the word out productively about this. And if you follow me on Instagram it's _ Nick Sisti, just my name, so NICK SISTI, it's _ Nick Sisti. That's where you could find anything I'm doing right now. Over time, the next 1 to 3 years, you'll start to see some content regarding this, some videos or articles. And the idea is to just slowly build it up in the background and eventually either become some sort of practitioner in this field or to work with a practitioner as a consultant in some capacity. Melanie, thank you so much for your time. I think it's an honor to be featured on here alongside all of these patients and practitioners. I really thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nick. Wishing you well. Thank you for listening and for your kind attention. To keep in touch, follow the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram. You can visit melaniepensack.com /the Heart of CIRS to donate. Your generosity helps to keep this podcast growing. May the awareness of CIRS spread far and wide, helping to change millions of lives for the better.